This is going to be a particularly hard commentary, and I'm not going to claim much objectivity as these events are very difficult to explore. So let's get into it. If you followed this series on fascism, I've been prone to citing Chomsky's work a lot. That doesn't mean I believe all of it is good or true. I just believe that it's pretty strongly based in evidence. But we're going to be exploring Die Hard 2, which might seem curious, as both confirming but also, I think, challenging what he gathers in his work. Now, the first Die Hard did have some politics, but I think you can fairly say it's very subdued, or it's in the background. But Die Hard 2 is a really shocking shift because the politics is pretty frontal, and using it as an example of fascism, I think, is pretty well legitimate. In fact, the writers actually admit that, yes, Iran Contra is being referenced in the film, and the references are pretty explicit. So we have this very clearly fascist military person in the form of Stewart, and we're not meant to identify with him. He's clearly evil. And we have this series of conspiracies where essentially what they're going to try to do is these soldiers are going to rescue this right-wing dictator, and of course John McClane steps in, and right, he stops them, and there we go. Now, if Chomsky is correct, and again he mostly is correct, that when Iran Contra actually came out in the 1980s, that the media didn't really focus on the deeper issues. And it's a large context. I can only give a very brief version here. I'll do something more extensive a little bit later. But essentially in the 1960s and 70s, there was still a very strong grip by the right wing in Latin America, but it was encountering some resistance. And in Nicaragua, especially, a revolutionary movement by the Sandinistas was able to overthrow the dictatorship there. And the U.S. immediately started to oppose the Sandinistas. Though there was, again, some modulation in policies, right? Carter was less extreme than Reagan, but when Reagan got into office, there was a very clear sense he was going to try to oppose the Sandinistas and all of these leftist movements. He didn't distinguish between any of them. They were just going to be opposed, period. And there was the backing of these very murderous and very clearly fascistic forces. And Chomsky cites a lot of good evidence that they were clearly fascist, and they identified themselves with the Nazis in Nazi Germany, but they still received support. But when the Iran-Contra scandal finally broke, they didn't really focus on that at all. In fact, they ignored a huge amount of the larger context, and they made it about this very narrow question of the drug dealing by the CIA and how they did and didn't work with the Iranians to fund the Contras. And the Contras were this sort of anti-Sandinista group. And again, there were some legitimate Nicaraguans who were opposed to the Sandinistas, but they didn't care about that. So, on the one hand, the film is referencing all these events that occurred in the 1980s, and it's clearly condemning it, right? Because McClane is opposing Stewart. And as we learn more and more as we go into the movie, the conspiracy is actually pretty large. Apparently, all these renegade people in the U.S. Army are part of this, and they're willing to follow this kind of anti-communist extremism to the point of murdering dozens and dozens of people, including Americans. And again, being Hollywood, you're going to think, well, this is a pretty extreme representation, even by the standards of Hollywood. And admittedly, Oliver North and Stewart are not identical, but the overlap is pretty astonishing. Because if you actually go back to his testimony and read up and do research, that North, did in fact really use a very similar defense that it was worth breaking the law in order to help fascism because fascism was better than the alternatives. So he really didn't have a choice. He had this very moralistic rhetoric and defending himself. And in terms of whether the military would be willing to do these kinds of civilian atrocities, even against Americans, there is actually some good evidence. For instance, this really good journalist, James Bamford, did actually uncover this thing called Operation Northwoods. during the Kennedy administration, some military figures actually did contemplate. They didn't carry it out. I want to be very careful. They didn't actually carry it out, but they actually did plan to assassinate entire groups of Americans and somehow blame this on Castro and use it as a pretext for invading Cuba. So, as extreme as it seems what is going on in Die Hard 2, it's not as completely fantastic as it seems. There really have been these very extreme right-wing conspiracies, these far-right conspiracies and fascist conspiracies occurring right before our eyes. So it does actually happen. And Chomsky is partly correct that the media really didn't focus on that. Their focus was more on the sensationalistic aspects of Iran-Contra. On the other hand, the question then, well, why are they covering it at all? Right? If Chomsky is correct, basically there wouldn't be anything on this. There wouldn't be any documentaries, there wouldn't be any films, there wouldn't be any critical media of this at all. Now he's right that they narrowed it a lot. They only handled this very sensationalistic side of it, these crazed fascists and being led by this madman, and they're not looking at the deeper policies, but they are at least covering it. So I think, again, the manufacturing consent model does make a lot of sense. There clearly is a way that the press and the media is biased. On the other hand, their control isn't totalistic. There is always some pushback. And Die Hard 2 is a very weird case because, again, we are seeing fascism, again, from America, and it is very evil, but it, again, is being stopped and even reversed by this heroic person. So it's trying to do both. And if you know Bruce Willis's politics, he's a conservative and a Republican. And I don't think that was lost on the writers or producers. So it's this kind of way of having it to both audiences. On the one hand, it's, quote, an anti-fascist message. On the other hand, it's a very kind of patriotic, pro-American message. And it is focusing on some aspects of Iran-Contra, but it is not going into detail about other aspects. So again, I think it's a very difficult case of where both Chomsky's right, but he's also wrong. All right, this has been Partially Examined Kubrick on misremembering the 1980s. Thank you for listening. Please be safe.